Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is standing beside a grave that nobody has visited in years. They aren't there to cry. They're there because the grave has become space, and eventually that space may be used again. Because here's something most of us don't like to think about. A grave can survive longer than a person, but it doesn't necessarily survive forever. In some parts of the world, old burial plots can eventually be reused. In London, for example, grave reuse was legally enabled under specific conditions, including a process known as lift and deepen, where older remains are reinterred deeper in the same grave before another burial takes place above them. The idea sounds disturbing, but historically, reusing burial space is not some strange modern invention. It happened because cemeteries have always had one unavoidable problem. There are more dead people than there is space to keep every grave untouched forever. And that's where this story gets much stranger. Because maybe the real question isn't, will my grave be there forever? Maybe the real question is, how long will anyone remember that it was mine? Most of us grow up with the idea that a grave is permanent, a stone, a name, a date, a little piece of land that somehow belongs to you after you're gone. But that idea, at least in its modern Western form, has a history. In 1831, Mount Auburn Cemetery opened near Boston. It helped popularize a new kind of cemetery in America: beautiful landscapes, carefully designed grounds, monuments, and permanent family lots. It wasn't simply a place to bury the dead. It was a place designed to preserve memory. And the idea became incredibly powerful. But look at what happens to almost every grave eventually. First, the visitors become less frequent. Then the flowers stop coming. The decorations disappear. The people who knew the person become old. Then they die too. Rain wears down the stone. Lichen covers the letters. The edges crack. Grass grows around it. And one day, someone can stand directly in front of the grave and have absolutely no idea who is underneath the grave hasn't disappeared. But something else has. The connection, and that's the part nobody likes to talk about, because human memory has a limit. Think about your own family. Can you name all 4 of your great-grandparents? Not just their names, their voices, their faces, what they were afraid of, what made them laugh, what food they loved, what they did on an ordinary Tuesday. For most of us, those details are already gone, and these weren't ancient people. They lived only a few generations before us. That's the strange mathematics of being human. Your parents may remember you in incredible detail. Your children may remember your voice. Your grandchildren may remember stories about you. But as generations pass, memory becomes thinner. A photograph replaces a face. A story replaces a person. A name replaces the story. And eventually, even the name can disappear, and sometimes forgetting begins long before the grave. Japan has a word for a particularly painful version of this: Kodokushi. A lonely death. In recent years, Japan has reported tens of thousands of people living alone being found dead at home, with thousands discovered weeks or months after death. The numbers are shocking, but the deeper story isn't really about Japan. It's about what happens when a person slowly disappears from the social world before they disappear from the physical one. Someone can have children who are still alive, friends who are still alive, relatives who could theoretically call, and yet the phone stops ringing. The visits stop happening. Nobody notices the silence, and eventually the person becomes invisible. The grave can become unvisited before the grave even exists. History gives us another unsettling example. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died in Vienna in 1791 at only 35 years old. He was buried in a common grave according to the burial customs of the time, but the exact location of his remains was never securely preserved. Today, there is a monument associated with Mozart at the cemetery, but it doesn't give us the certainty people imagine when they think of a famous person's grave. Even one of history's most recognizable names couldn't guarantee that his physical resting place would remain identifiable. And then there's another kind of forgetting, the kind that happens to fame. In the 1920s, Rudolph Valentino was one of the biggest movie stars on Earth. When he died in 1926, enormous crowds gathered to mourn him. His death caused public hysteria. People fainted. Riots broke out. For a moment, it seemed impossible that the world could ever forget him. But a century later, how many people watching this video could recognize his face? That's the uncomfortable lesson. Fame feels permanent when you're inside it. History doesn't. David Eagleman once described death as having three stages. The first is when your body stops functioning. The second is when your body is buried or otherwise disposed of. And the third is when your name is spoken for the final time. That third death isn't a scientific measurement, it's a thought experiment, but it's a terrifyingly useful one because it asks a question most people never ask. What happens when nobody alive remembers you? Your children will probably remember you, not just your name. They'll remember little things, the way you spoke, the way you got angry, the jokes you repeated, the way you held their hand. Your grandchildren may remember fragments, a photograph, a story, a holiday, a smell from your house. Your great-grandchildren may know that you existed. They may see your name on a family tree, but perhaps that's all. And after enough generations, there may be nothing. Now here's the part that might actually make you feel better, because the same process that erases you also erases the people you're afraid of. The boss who humiliated you, the person who judged you, the relative who compared you to everyone else, the friend who betrayed you. You are spending enormous amounts of emotional energy worrying about people who themselves are temporary. Their judgment is temporary. Their criticism is temporary. Even your embarrassment is temporary. Eventually, all of it disappears into the same silence. Marcus Aurelius understood something like this nearly 2,000 years ago. The people whose approval you're desperately chasing will eventually become dust, and so will you. That's not necessarily depressing. It can be incredibly freeing. Because if almost nobody will remember what you did 100 years from now, then maybe you don't need to perform for everyone today. Think about the number of people you're trying to impress, your coworkers, your neighbors, people online, people you haven't spoken to in years, people who probably don't think about you nearly as much as you imagine. Your real audience may be much smaller than you think. The people who actually love you, the people whose lives you can genuinely touch, that's where your time matters. And here's something even stranger. You have already forgotten versions of yourself. Think about the person you were 10 years ago. What did they desperately want? What did they worry about every night? Who were their closest friends? What dream did they think would change everything? You probably don't remember all of it. That person was you, and yet parts of them are already gone. The childhood friend you promised you'd never lose touch with. The teacher who taught you something important. The neighbor who watched you grow up. The person who once gave you exactly the right advice at exactly the right time. Somewhere in your life, there are people who remember you, while you can't even remember their faces. That's the other side of forgetting. You're not just being forgotten, you're forgetting too. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe it's how life works. Because if every memory stayed perfectly vivid forever, there would be no room for new ones. If every mistake stayed emotionally alive, you could never move on. If every embarrassment remained permanent, you would spend your entire life trapped inside your past. Forgetting hurts, but forgetting also makes room for life. And this is where the story changes. Because maybe the goal was never to become unforgettable. Maybe that's impossible. Even some of the most famous people in history eventually become names that only specialists recognize. A tiny fraction of the billions of people who have ever lived are remembered for thousands of years. For everyone else, the world eventually moves on. So what survives? Not necessarily your name, not your photograph, not your grave, something much smaller and much more ordinary. A phrase your grandfather used, that your parent repeated, that you accidentally picked up, and one day your child says without knowing where it came from. A recipe nobody remembers learning. A habit, a joke, a kindness, a lesson. Something you said to someone on the worst day of their life that they later said to someone else. You may disappear, but pieces of what you did can continue moving through other people. Most of your life will never become history. The ordinary Tuesday, the dinner you cooked, the walk you took for no reason, the conversation that made you laugh, the 5 minutes you spent helping someone. None of that will appear in an obituary, and it doesn't need to, because those moments weren't meant for history. They were meant for living. Maybe that's the real lesson of the grave. Not that everything is meaningless because everything ends, but the opposite. Everything matters precisely because it ends. You don't need to be remembered forever. You need to be here while you're here. Call the person you've been meaning to call. Say the thing you've been postponing. Spend the afternoon with someone you love. Take the photograph. Cook the meal. Go outside. Laugh. Because one day there will be a grave where your name once mattered. And eventually, even that name may fade. But right now you're still here. And that is the part you actually get to choose. So don't spend your entire life trying to become unforgettable. Spend it becoming someone worth remembering to the people who are here now, because eternity was never promised. But today was